The thermometer outside Duncan McVeigh's cabin read -42 degrees, and through his window he could see the Drummond family's cabin collapsing under the weight of ice that had formed when their roof failed 3 hours earlier. Inside his own cabin, Duncan sat in his shirt sleeves, the fire burning low, warm air circulating freely through the space beneath his double roof, while his neighbors froze less than 200 yards away. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories like this one interest you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story is even more impossible than this one. Duncan McVeigh had not slept in 36 hours. He stood at his cabin window watching the Drummond place through the darkness, watching the way lamplight flickered behind frost-covered glass, watching smoke pour from their chimney in desperate quantities that told him they were burning everything they could find to stay alive. The temperature had dropped past -40 sometime around midnight. It was now 3 in the morning on January 19, 1877, and Duncan knew that Lachlan Drummond's family would not survive until dawn in that cabin. The irony was not lost on him. 6 months earlier, Lachlan had stood in this exact spot, looking up at the massive second roof Duncan was building over his cabin, and laughed until tears ran down his face. He had called it McVeigh's Folly. He had asked Duncan if he planned to stack 3 or 4 roofs before he was satisfied. He had told everyone at Alistair Breck's trading post that the war had broken something in Duncan's mind, that no sane man would waste an entire summer building a second roof over a perfectly good cabin. Now Lachlan's cabin was dying, and Duncan's cabin was so warm he had opened the door twice during the night just to let cold air in because the heat beneath his double roof had become uncomfortable. The fire in his stone hearth was modest, burning less than a quarter of the wood his neighbors were consuming. Yet the temperature inside remained steady and comfortable. The air was dry. No frost formed on the interior walls. No ice built up around the window frames. The massive posts outside held the outer roof steady under tons of accumulated snow, and the 3-foot gap between that outer roof and his cabin's actual roof created a buffer zone that transformed how heat moved through the structure. Duncan had tried to explain it to them. He had drawn diagrams in the dirt outside the trading post. He had used words like thermal mass and convective loss and dead air space. Angus Rafferty had interrupted him to say that mountain men had been building cabins for 50 years without needing fancy military words, and if the old methods were good enough for the trappers, they were good enough for homesteaders. The others had nodded agreement. Only old Tavish Holcomb had looked at Duncan's drawings with something other than dismissal in his eyes. Through the window, Duncan saw the lamp in the Drummond cabin flicker and nearly go out. Someone inside was moving around, probably trying to block gaps in the walls with whatever fabric they could find, trying to stop the cold from pouring through spaces between logs that had seemed adequate in autumn, but were now highways for freezing air. He knew exactly what was happening in that cabin because he had lived through it himself during his first winter in this territory, the winter before he built his second roof, the winter that had nearly killed him and had taught him that frontier tradition was not the same as frontier wisdom. Duncan had learned about cold during the war, but not in the way most soldiers did. Most men experienced cold as discomfort during winter campaigns, something to endure between battles. Duncan had learned it as a tactical problem during his final mission as a sniper in the Union Army, operating behind Confederate lines in the mountains of eastern Tennessee during February of 1865. He and his spotter Callum Horn had been positioned in a hide overlooking a supply route for 6 days. They had built their position carefully, camouflaged it perfectly, and settled in to wait for their target, a Confederate officer known to travel the route twice weekly. The mission required patience and stillness, qualities Duncan possessed naturally. What he had not anticipated was how cold could kill as efficiently as any bullet. Their hide was well constructed by military standards. They had dug into the hillside, covered the opening with branches and snow, created a space barely large enough for two men lying side by side. It kept them invisible. It blocked the wind. But it did nothing to preserve body heat in temperatures that dropped below zero at night. They could not light a fire. Smoke would give away their position. They could not move around to generate warmth. Movement might reveal them to patrols. They could only lie still, wrapped in whatever blankets they carried, and wait. Callum started showing signs on the fourth day. His speech slowed. His hands shook when he held the spotting scope. He insisted he was fine, that he just needed to sleep more. Duncan knew better, but the mission parameters were clear. They had orders to remain in position until the target appeared or until 8 days had passed. Leaving early was not acceptable unless they were compromised. On the 6th night, Callum stopped shivering. Duncan recognized the sign immediately. When the body stops shivering in extreme cold, it means the core temperature has dropped to dangerous levels. He tried to warm Callum using their combined blankets and body heat, but in that frozen hole in the ground, there was no warmth to share. By morning, Callum was unconscious. By noon, he was dead. Not from enemy action, not from wounds sustained in combat, from cold that had drained the life from him gradually over 6 days while they lay waiting for a target that never appeared. Duncan abandoned the mission, carried Callum's body down the mountain, and reported to his commanding officer. He was not reprimanded. The officer noted that Duncan had followed orders until circumstances made continuation impossible. But Duncan understood something that day that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Cold was not just discomfort to endure. It was an enemy that killed methodically, and the only defense was proper shelter. Not adequate shelter, not traditional shelter. Proper shelter built with understanding of how heat moved and how cold penetrated, and how the difference between life and death was often just a matter of engineering. Spring of 1876 brought Duncan McVeigh to the Montana Territory with a land claim, a wagon of supplies, and memories he could not outrun. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres to any man willing to work the land for 5 years. Duncan was willing. He wanted distance from cities, from crowds, from anything that reminded him of the war. The Northern Territories offered that distance in abundance. He filed his claim at the land office in Helena, then traveled north for 3 days until he found a valley that suited his requirements. Good timber, a creek that would not run dry in summer, high ground that would drain properly, game trails indicating reliable hunting. The nearest neighbor was Angus Rafferty, whose cabin stood 2 miles east. The small settlement that formed around Alistair Breck's trading post was 5 miles south. It was isolated enough for Duncan's purposes while still providing access to supplies and occasional human contact when needed. Duncan built his first cabin using the methods every man in the territory used. He cut lodgepole pines from the surrounding forest, notched them at the corners using a saddle joint pattern, and stacked them into walls. He chinked the gaps between logs with moss mixed with clay from the creek bank. He built a simple door from split planks. He framed a small window and covered it with oiled paper, since glass was expensive and difficult to transport. He constructed a roof from poles covered with bark and sod. The entire structure took him 9 days working alone. Angus Rafferty visited during the construction and pronounced it adequate work. The cabin was 12 feet by 16 feet, large enough for a single man, small enough to heat with a modest fireplace. Angus helped Duncan build the stone hearth and chimney, and in exchange, Duncan helped Angus repair a section of fence damaged during the spring thaw. It was how things worked in isolated settlements. Men helped each other with large tasks and expected that help to be returned when needed. Tavish Holcomb, an elderly Scotsman who had been in the territory since the fur trading days of the 1840s, stopped by to inspect Duncan's work. Tavish said little, but he walked around the cabin slowly, examining the corners, testing the door, looking up at the roof. Finally, he said that it would keep the rain out, and that was about all a man could ask from logs and mud. Duncan asked if there was something wrong with the construction. Tavish said there was nothing wrong with it, that it was built exactly like every other cabin in the territory, and that was precisely the problem. He did not elaborate, and Duncan did not press him for explanation. Duncan's first winter in the Montana Territory began with confidence and ended with a lesson that nearly cost him his life. He had stocked the cabin with what he considered adequate supplies: 8 cords of firewood split and stacked under a simple lean-to shelter. Enough dried beans, salt pork, and flour to last until spring. A good rifle and sufficient ammunition for hunting. He had survived winters in Kentucky and Tennessee. He had endured the winter that killed Callum in those Tennessee mountains. He thought he understood cold. November brought the first serious snow, and Duncan began burning through his firewood faster than anticipated. The cabin's stone fireplace drew well and produced good heat, but that heat seemed to pour out of the structure as fast as he could generate it. He kept the fire burning constantly, feeding it logs throughout the day and night, yet the interior temperature remained barely comfortable. He wore his heavy coat indoors. He slept under every blanket he owned. By December, he realized the 8 cords of firewood would not last until spring at his current consumption rate. He began cutting more wood, working in temperatures that made the axe handle painful to grip, hauling logs through snow that reached his knees. It became a desperate cycle. Cutting wood burned calories that required more food. Burning wood to stay warm required cutting more wood. The mathematics of survival were becoming unfavorable. The real problem revealed itself during a cold snap in January, when temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for a week. Duncan woke one morning to find frost covering the interior walls of his cabin. Ice had formed on the oiled paper window. His water bucket had frozen solid despite sitting near the fireplace. He kept the fire roaring, burning wood as fast as he could split it. Yet the cold seemed to pour through the walls like water through a sieve. He began noticing things he had not paid attention to during construction. The gaps between logs that had seemed adequately chinked were actually channels where cold air flowed freely. The moss and clay chinking had dried and cracked, creating spaces where wind penetrated. The single-layer roof, with its bark and sod covering, provided minimal insulation. Heat rose naturally, hit the roof, and transferred directly through to the outside air. The door, despite being solid wood, had gaps around its frame that allowed drafts. One night, during that cold week, Duncan lay under his blankets listening to the wind outside and calculating his remaining firewood supply against the weeks of winter still ahead. The mathematics were clear. If temperatures stayed this cold, he would run out of wood before spring. Without wood, the cabin would become uninhabitable. He would have to abandon his claim and retreat to Helena or some other settlement, forfeiting his homestead rights and the year of work he had invested. That was the night Duncan decided that surviving was not the same as living, and that building a cabin the way everyone else built cabins meant suffering the way everyone else suffered. Duncan survived his first winter by burning every scrap of wood he could find and spending the coldest weeks wrapped in blankets near a fire that consumed his supplies with terrifying speed. When spring finally arrived in late March, he had less than half a cord of firewood remaining and had lost 20 pounds from his already lean frame. He had survived, but barely, and he understood that survival by desperation was not a sustainable strategy. Other men in the territory treated winter hardship as inevitable. They accepted frozen mornings and constant woodcutting and the bone-deep cold that pervaded their cabins as simply the cost of living in the North. Duncan could not accept that explanation. His military training had taught him to analyze problems systematically, to study why things failed and how they could be improved. He began treating heat loss as a tactical problem requiring reconnaissance and analysis. He started visiting neighbors' cabins with new eyes, not as social calls, but as field studies. At Angus Rafferty's place, he noticed ice dams forming along the roof edge where snow melted from interior heat, then refroze at the eaves, creating barriers that trapped water and eventually leaked through the roof. At Lachlan Drummond's cabin, he observed frost patterns on interior walls that showed exactly where cold air penetrated. At every structure, he saw the same fundamental issues repeating. The problem was heat moving through roofs. Duncan lay awake at night thinking about it, remembering principles he had learned during the war. Heat rises. That was basic physics. In a cabin, warm air from the fire rose to the ceiling, hit the roof structure, and immediately began transferring through the wood to the cold air outside. Single-layer roofs provided almost no resistance to that transfer. The result was a constant flow of heat upward and outward, requiring constant fire to replace what was being lost. He studied snow patterns on roofs throughout the settlement. Fresh snow on a cabin roof would melt within hours from heat escaping through the structure. That melted snow would run down to the cold eaves and freeze, creating the ice dams he had observed. The amount of melting indicated the amount of heat being wasted. Duncan's own cabin roof showed the same pattern. Heat he was generating with precious firewood was simply pouring through the roof into the winter sky. Duncan visited Tavish Holcomb in early April and asked the old trapper about cabin construction. Tavish said that most men built the way they had been taught, which was the way their fathers had been taught, which was the way trappers had built in the mountains 50 years earlier. Nobody questioned whether there might be better methods because the current methods were traditional, and tradition carried weight in frontier communities. Duncan asked if tradition was more important than survival. Tavish looked at him for a long moment, then said that was a question more men should ask, but few ever did. He told Duncan that if he figured out something better, he should build it and ignore whatever people said about it. Duncan spent late spring and early summer of 1876 working his land, planting a small garden, hunting, and thinking constantly about thermal dynamics. His mind kept returning to military experiences, particularly field engineering training he had received before his sniper assignments. The Army taught soldiers how to build shelters that concealed them while maintaining survivable conditions, and those lessons had included basic principles about heat retention and insulation. He remembered a lecture from an engineering officer about how the best insulation was often just air, but only if that air was trapped and prevented from moving. Moving air carried heat away through convection. Trapped air created a barrier that heat could not easily cross. The officer had explained how double walls in powder magazines kept contents dry and stable by creating dead air spaces that prevented temperature fluctuations. Duncan had not thought much about it at the time, but now the principle seemed directly applicable to his cabin problem. He also remembered lessons about thermal signatures from his sniper training. Officers taught snipers how to minimize the heat signature of their positions, because enemy scouts with experience could detect occupied positions by observing how snow melted or how frost patterns changed around concealed shelters. The key was preventing heat from reaching surfaces where it would create visible signs. That meant creating barriers and air gaps that interrupted heat flow before it reached the outer surfaces. Duncan began sketching ideas in a notebook he kept. His drawings were crude, but they captured concepts he was developing. What if a cabin had 2 roofs instead of 1? What if there was a gap between those roofs, a space filled with trapped air that would slow heat transfer? The inner roof would be warm from interior heat, but that heat would have to cross through air before reaching the outer roof. Air was a poor conductor of heat. It would take much longer for warmth to transfer through several feet of air than through a few inches of wood. He thought about how the design would work structurally. The outer roof would need its own support system, posts and beams that bore its weight independently from the cabin walls. Those posts would have to be substantial because the outer roof would need to handle snow loads just like any roof. The spacing between roofs would need to be significant, at least 3 or 4 feet, to create a meaningful air barrier. The sides would need to be open to prevent moisture buildup in the gap, but that openness would also allow air circulation that might reduce the insulation effect. Duncan spent days considering these competing requirements, trying to balance structural needs against thermal performance. He was not an engineer by training, but he understood basic principles, and he trusted his ability to work through problems methodically. By mid-June, he had developed a design that seemed workable: a cabin with a standard roof for weather protection, then a second, larger roof supported by posts set around the cabin perimeter, creating a covered space surrounding the structure with an air gap above it. The design looked strange in his drawings, but the physics seemed sound. Duncan's design required more timber and labor than any reasonable person would invest in a cabin, and he knew that before he began. A standard cabin used perhaps 50 trees for walls, roof, and structural elements. His design would require at least 80 trees, including massive specimens for the outer roof posts. The additional work would extend construction time from days to months. The cost in nails, hardware, and materials from the trading post would consume most of his savings. But the alternative was enduring another winter like the last one, and Duncan would rather be poor and warm than comfortable financially and frozen. He began by selecting trees for the outer roof posts. These needed to be straight, thick, and strong enough to support significant weight without settling or shifting. He spent a week ranging through the forest marking candidates before he cut a single tree. Each post would need to be at least 14 inches in diameter at the base and rise 10 feet above ground. He needed 8 of them, positioned at the corners and midpoints of the structure's perimeter. Finding 8 perfect specimens required searching a wide area and making careful measurements. The mathematical calculations occupied Duncan for several evenings. The outer roof needed to extend at least 6 feet beyond the cabin walls on all sides to create meaningful coverage. That meant the roof span would be approximately 24 feet across if the cabin remained its current 12-foot width. Supporting a 24-foot roof span required heavy rafters and a strong ridge beam. The weight of the roof structure plus accumulated snow could easily reach several tons. Dividing that weight across 8 posts meant each post would carry roughly 500 pounds, possibly more during heavy snow. The posts needed foundations deep enough to prevent frost heave from shifting them during winter freeze-thaw cycles. Duncan sketched the complete design and took it to show Tavish Holcomb in early July. Tavish studied the drawings silently for several minutes, then asked what problem Duncan was trying to solve. Duncan explained his observations about heat loss through roofs and his theory about creating an air barrier. Tavish asked why he did not simply add more insulation to his existing roof. Duncan explained that insulation helped but did not address the fundamental issue of heat transfer, and that creating a large air gap would be more effective than any practical amount of insulation material he could obtain. Tavish handed back the drawings and said it might work, or it might be the most elaborate waste of time he had seen in 40 years on the frontier. He said that either way Duncan would learn something, and that learning was worth more than gold if a man paid attention. He warned that other people would mock the effort, that frontier communities distrusted innovation because survival depended on proven methods, and that Duncan should prepare for ridicule. Duncan said he had been ridiculed before and had survived it. Tavish smiled and said that was the correct attitude for a man planning to build something nobody else believed in. Duncan made the mistake of explaining his design to Angus Rafferty in late July, thinking that sharing his reasoning might inspire interest, or at least understanding. He spread his drawings on a table at Alistair Breck's trading post, while several men gathered to look. Angus studied the sketches for perhaps 30 seconds before laughing so hard he had to sit down. The other men joined in quickly, their laughter filling the small trading post with a sound that made Duncan's face burn with embarrassment he tried not to show. Angus asked why any sane man would build 2 roofs when one roof was already more work than most people wanted to do. Duncan tried to explain about heat transfer and air gaps and thermal barriers, but his words sounded technical and strange compared to the simple logic of traditional construction. Lachlan Drummond interrupted to say that his grandfather had built cabins with single roofs and had lived to be 73, so clearly the design was adequate. Others nodded agreement. One man suggested that the war had affected Duncan's thinking in unfortunate ways. Alistair Breck, who was more businessman than frontiersman, asked practical questions about cost. Duncan admitted he would need significant additional timber, more nails than standard construction required, and heavy hardware for supporting the posts. Alistair calculated rough numbers and told Duncan he was looking at spending 3 times what a normal cabin cost in materials alone. Angus said that for that price, Duncan could build 3 separate cabins and rotate between them to let each one warm up. The men found this hilarious. The mockery followed Duncan through the summer. When he began cutting trees for the outer posts, neighbors who saw him working would stop to ask if he was building a fortress or a trading post or maybe a church. When he hauled the massive logs to his cabin site, men joked that he must be compensating for something. The humor was not particularly malicious, but it was constant and made clear that the community viewed his project as foolish eccentricity rather than serious innovation. Young Josiah Crane, a homesteader barely 20 years old who had claimed land south of the settlement, stopped by to watch Duncan work one afternoon in August. Unlike the others, Josiah asked genuine questions about the design rather than making jokes. He wanted to know how the air gap would prevent heat loss and whether the open sides would defeat the purpose. Duncan explained as best he could, acknowledging that he was working partly from theory and partly from intuition. Josiah said it seemed logical, even if nobody else thought so. Duncan appreciated the interest, but warned Josiah not to mention supporting the design publicly unless he wanted to share in the ridicule. Josiah said he was already considered odd for reading books and trying to grow crops nobody else thought would survive in the territory, so more ridicule would not hurt him. Duncan found himself liking the young man's attitude. Duncan began the actual construction in mid-August, starting with foundations for the 8 outer posts. Most frontier building place posts directly on the ground or into shallow holes, accepting that eventual settling and shifting was inevitable. Duncan could not accept that approach for posts that would carry tons of weight. He needed foundations that would remain stable through years of freeze-thaw cycles and prevent any structural movement that might compromise the roof above. He dug each foundation hole 3 feet deep, well below the frost line he estimated from observations during his first winter. The digging was brutal work in soil mixed with rocks and tree roots. Each hole took a full day to excavate properly. He lined the bottom 6 inches of each hole with large flat stones to create a stable base, then positioned the post and packed additional stones around it to hold it plumb. The remaining space he filled with a mixture of smaller rocks and compacted soil, creating a solid mass that would resist shifting. Setting the posts plumb and at precisely the correct height required patience and constant adjustment. Duncan used a plumb line made from string and a stone to check vertical alignment from multiple angles. He used a water level, just a length of hollow reed filled with water, to ensure all 8 posts stood at exactly the same height relative to each other. The technique was time-consuming but accurate. After 3 weeks, all 8 posts stood firm, perfectly vertical, and level with each other. Angus Rafferty visited during this phase and stood watching Duncan check his measurements for the dozenth time. Angus said that most men would have finished building an entire cabin in the time Duncan had spent just setting posts. Duncan replied that most men also spent their winters freezing and burning excessive firewood. Angus said that was just how winter was, and no amount of fancy construction would change weather. Duncan said he was not trying to change weather, just how his cabin responded to it. Angus shook his head and left without further comment. The next phase required lifting heavy rafters onto the posts to create the outer roof frame. Duncan built a simple pulley system using rope and a block he had purchased from Alistair Breck specifically for this purpose. Working alone, he could not lift the massive ridge beam and rafters by strength alone. The pulley system let him raise each timber incrementally, securing it at intervals until it reached the proper height. The work was slow and required careful attention to prevent injury or damage. By mid-September, the outer roof frame was complete. 8 posts stood supporting a network of heavy timbers that would carry the roof surface. The structure looked strange, standing open and incomplete, like the skeleton of some oversized building rather than a simple cabin. Neighbors passing by would stop and stare, usually shaking their heads before continuing on their way. The outer roof required careful construction to handle the snow loads Duncan expected during winter. He had observed that snow accumulation on cabin roofs could reach 2 or 3 feet during heavy winters, and his outer roof would need to support that weight across a much larger span than typical cabin roofs covered. The engineering was straightforward but required attention to detail. Rafters needed to be spaced close enough that the roof boards would not sag between them. The pitch needed to be steep enough to shed some snow, but not so steep that construction became difficult. Duncan selected the pitch by studying existing buildings in the area and noting which roofs seemed to perform best. A 45-degree slope appeared optimal, steep enough for good drainage but manageable for construction. He cut rafters from straight pines, notching each one to sit securely on the support beams. The rafters extended from the central ridge beam down to the outer edges of the structure, creating the angled surfaces that would carry the roof boards. Over the rafters, he laid boards hewn flat on one side. This was tedious work that consumed weeks of his time. Each board needed to be shaped using a broadaxe and draw knife until it presented a reasonably flat surface. The boards overlapped like shingles, each layer covering gaps in the layer below to prevent water infiltration. He secured each board with nails driven through into the rafters below, creating a solid surface that would not shift or separate. The roofing material itself was a combination of methods Duncan had observed and adapted. He started with a layer of birch bark laid over the boards. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible, conforming to minor irregularities in the surface. Over the bark, he spread a thick layer of sod, living grass and soil that would root and create a living roof. The sod provided insulation and additional waterproofing, while adding significant weight that would help anchor the structure against wind. The completed outer roof extended 6 feet beyond the cabin walls on all sides, creating a broad, covered area around the entire structure. Standing inside this covered space felt like standing in an enormous porch that surrounded the cabin. The ground beneath the outer roof remained dry even during rain. Snow that fell landed on the outer roof, leaving the covered perimeter clear. The effect was striking even before winter arrived. Angus visited again in early October and walked around the completed structure slowly. He admitted that the covered space would be useful for storing firewood and working during bad weather. Duncan agreed that was a benefit he had planned for. Angus asked if Duncan really believed the air gap above would make any difference to interior temperature. Duncan said he would know for certain once winter arrived, but that the physics suggested it should work. Angus said physics was fine for educated men, but that experience mattered more on the frontier. The space between Duncan's cabin roof and the outer roof above it measured 3.5 feet at the peak, narrowing to about 18 inches at the edges where the slopes met. This gap was the heart of his design, the element that would either validate his theory or prove him a fool. The principle was simple in concept but unprecedented in frontier construction. Heat rising from his cabin would warm the cabin's own roof, but that heat would then have to cross through several feet of relatively still air before reaching the outer roof where it could escape to the outside. Duncan had deliberately left the sides of this air gap open to the covered space below. Some might think this defeated the insulation purpose, but he had specific reasons for the design. Completely sealing the gap would trap moisture from the cabin, creating condensation that would rot the wood and cause structural damage over time. The open sides allowed air circulation that would carry moisture away while still maintaining enough dead air space to slow heat transfer significantly. The key was that air movement in the gap would be minimal compared to open exposure, creating what he thought of as a thermal buffer zone. Explaining this concept to Angus Rafferty one afternoon in late October proved difficult. Angus struggled with the idea that empty space could provide insulation. He understood that thick walls or multiple layers of material could slow heat loss, but the notion that air itself could act as a barrier seemed counterintuitive. Duncan tried various explanations, finally asking Angus why a man wore a thick coat in winter rather than a thin one. Angus said obviously because thick coats were warmer. Duncan explained that the thickness was mostly trapping air between fibers, and that trapped air was what actually provided the warmth. Angus considered this, then asked why Duncan had not simply stuffed the gap full of straw or moss or some material that would trap even more air. Duncan explained that the large air gap allowed for ventilation that would prevent moisture problems, and that the volume of air involved would still provide substantial insulation without the risk of material settling, compacting, or rotting over time. Angus remained skeptical, but admitted the reasoning made a kind of sense, even if it seemed overly complicated. The conversation attracted Lachlan Drummond's attention. Lachlan had been hauling supplies past Duncan's cabin and stopped to listen. He asked Duncan how much firewood he expected to burn during the coming winter. Duncan estimated he would need perhaps 4 cords, maybe 5 if the winter was particularly severe. Lachlan laughed and said that Duncan must have forgotten to account for something, because 5 cords would not last past January. Duncan's cabin was roughly the same size as Lachlan's, and Lachlan burned at least 10 cords each winter. Duncan said he understood the estimate sounded low, but that he believed his design would reduce consumption significantly. Lachlan shook his head and said that Duncan would learn the hard way that fancy roofs did not change the basic reality of mountain winters. The first snow arrived in early November, a modest storm that left 4 inches of accumulation across the settlement. Duncan woke that morning to find his cabin noticeably warmer than it had been during the previous winter's first snow. The fire in his hearth had burned down to coals overnight, yet the interior temperature remained comfortable enough that he did not immediately need to rebuild the fire. He walked outside into the covered space beneath his outer roof and found the ground almost entirely clear of snow. The outer roof had caught everything, leaving his immediate surroundings dry and accessible. More significant was what he observed on the roof itself. Snow lay evenly across the outer roof surface, with no signs of melting. The entire outer roof remained uniformly white, while neighboring cabins already showed bare patches where interior heat was melting snow and creating the ice dam problems Duncan had observed the previous year. His outer roof stayed cold because very little heat from his cabin was reaching it. The air gap was working exactly as he had theorized. Duncan rebuilt his fire and monitored his firewood consumption carefully over the following days. He burned approximately 2 logs every 4 hours to maintain comfortable interior temperature. The previous winter, he had burned at least double that amount during similar weather. The reduction was substantial and immediately noticeable. If these rates held through the entire winter, he would finish the season with firewood to spare, rather than running dangerously low. Tavish Holcomb visited in mid-November and examined the snow patterns on Duncan's roof with interest. He walked around the entire structure, noting how the outer roof remained uniformly covered, while the cabin's actual roof beneath it showed no signs of heat transfer. Tavish said that it appeared Duncan's theory was proving correct, at least during moderate weather. The real test would come when temperatures dropped well below 0 and stayed there for extended periods. Duncan agreed, but felt encouraged by the early results. Angus Rafferty also noticed the difference when he stopped by to borrow tools in late November. He commented that Duncan's cabin seemed warmer than expected, given the small fire burning in the hearth. Duncan pointed out his firewood consumption rates and compared them to what he had burned the previous winter. Angus attributed the difference to the current winter being milder than the last, suggesting that Duncan was experiencing favorable weather rather than benefiting from his construction design. Duncan did not argue, knowing that winter was far from over and that more severe cold would eventually arrive. Young Josiah Crane proved more receptive. He visited specifically to see how the design was performing and spent an hour examining the roof, the air gap, and the thermal patterns Duncan described. Josiah asked detailed questions about how the open sides affected the insulation value and whether sealing them would improve performance. Duncan explained his reasoning about moisture control and noted that completely sealed air gaps might work in drier climates, but would likely cause rot problems in the northern mountains. December brought colder weather, but nothing exceptional, and the settlement fell into the routine patterns of winter survival. Men cut firewood, checked trap lines when weather permitted, and spent long evenings in their cabins waiting for spring. Duncan continued monitoring his fuel consumption and comparing it to the previous winter's desperate rates. The double roof was performing better than he had hoped. His cabin remained consistently warm, with roughly half the firewood he had burned the year before, and the interior stayed dry with no frost forming on walls or windows. Tavish Holcomb appeared at Duncan's cabin on a gray afternoon in early January with an unusual sense of urgency in his manner. Tavish had lived in the territory longer than anyone else in the area and had developed what he called a feel for weather patterns. He told Duncan that signs pointed towards severe cold approaching within days. The signs were subtle things that younger men often missed. Birds had disappeared from the area completely. Certain trees showed bark patterns that Tavish associated with extreme temperature drops. The wind had shifted to come from the northwest with a steady persistence that suggested a large weather system pushing south from Canada. Duncan asked how cold Tavish expected. The old man said he had seen similar patterns 3 times in 40 years, and each time temperatures had dropped below -30 and stayed there for at least a week. During one event in the 1850s, temperatures had reached -50. Men had died that winter, frozen in their cabins when firewood supplies ran out, or when poorly constructed structures failed to protect them. Tavish said he had visited Duncan specifically to warn him, because Duncan was the only person in the area whose cabin might actually survive truly severe cold without excessive suffering. The warning troubled Duncan because it implied his neighbors might face serious danger. He asked Tavish if others in the settlement were prepared for extreme conditions. Tavish said that most people had adequate firewood if they were willing to burn it at high rates, but that their cabins would become increasingly. On January 15, 1877, it reached -20. By January 16, -30. The cold felt different from normal winter weather. The air seemed to have a physical weight to it. On January 17th, the thermometer outside Duncan's cabin read -38 degrees at dawn. By noon, it had dropped to -42. This was cold beyond what most settlers had experienced, cold that turned exposed skin white with frostbite in minutes, cold that made metal brittle and wood crack with sharp reports like gunfire. The sky remained clear, a brilliant pale blue that seemed to mock the brutal temperatures below. Clear skies meant no cloud cover to trap heat, allowing temperatures to plummet even further as night approached. Duncan maintained his fire at a steady rate, adding logs every few hours but not frantically feeding the flames. His cabin remained comfortable. The double roof was performing exactly as designed. Heat rose from his hearth, warmed the cabin's interior roof, then dissipated slowly through the air gap rather than pouring directly through to the outside. He could feel the difference from his first winter. That year, at these temperatures, he would have been burning wood constantly, wearing every piece of clothing he owned, and still shivering. Now he sat in relative comfort, his fire modest, his wood consumption sustainable. Through his window, Duncan could see smoke pouring from neighboring chimneys in thick columns. Angus Rafferty's cabin 300 yards south showed steady smoke output that indicated he was burning wood at rates Duncan remembered from his desperate first winter. Lachlan Drummond's place 200 yards east showed even heavier smoke. They were fighting the cold with brute force, burning everything they could feed into their fireplaces, trying to generate enough heat to overcome the massive losses through their single-layer roofs and poorly sealed walls. By evening of the 17th, Duncan began noticing ice forming on his neighbors' roofs, despite the extreme cold. This seemed counterintuitive until he understood what was happening. The desperate heat they were generating inside their cabins was pouring through their roofs so rapidly that it was melting snow even in -40 temperatures. That meltwater ran down to the eaves, which were cold because they extended beyond the heated interior space and immediately froze into massive ice dams. Those ice dams would trap subsequent meltwater, creating pools that would eventually leak through the roof or cause structural damage. Duncan's outer roof showed no such problems. The snow lying on it remained frozen and stable because very little heat reached it from his cabin below. The outer roof stayed cold, which was exactly what he wanted. Cold roofs did not create ice dams. Cold roofs did not waste heat melting snow. The paradox of effective winter construction was that your outer surfaces should stay as cold as the surrounding air while your interior stayed warm. And the space between those two realities was where engineering mattered. Night fell early, as it did in January this far north, and temperatures continued dropping. Duncan estimated it would reach -45 or worse before dawn. He added extra logs to his fire before settling in to sleep, confident his cabin would protect him through whatever the night brought. Duncan woke at 2 in the morning to a sound he initially could not identify. A sharp crack, like a rifle shot, echoed across the frozen landscape, followed seconds later by a heavy crash. He moved to his window and looked toward the Drummond cabin. Even in darkness, he could see something was wrong. The smoke from Lachlan's chimney, which had been steady earlier, now seemed irregular. Duncan lit a lamp and watched for several minutes, trying to understand what had happened. Another crack sounded, this one clearly from the direction of the Drummond place. Duncan recognized it now. Ice breaking. The massive ice dam that had formed on Lachlan's roof had finally grown too heavy for the structure. The weight had either torn part of the roof free or caused the dam itself to collapse. Either outcome was catastrophic in these temperatures. If the roof was damaged, cold air would pour directly into the cabin. If the ice dam had collapsed inward, it might have damaged the chimney or blocked ventilation, creating a smoke problem that could be equally dangerous. Duncan dressed quickly, pulling on every warm layer he owned. He grabbed his rifle and a spare blanket, though he was not sure what help he could offer. The walk to the Drummond cabin took less than 5 minutes, but felt like an hour. The cold was so intense it hurt to breathe. Ice crystals formed in his beard from his breath. His eyes watered and the tears froze on his cheeks. This was cold that could kill a man who stayed in it too long. At the Drummond cabin, the situation was worse than he had imagined. A section of the roof at the eave had torn free when the ice dam collapsed. The ice itself had fallen through into the cabin, and Duncan could see through the damaged roof into the interior, where lamplight showed Lachlan and his wife Moira trying to block the opening with blankets and furniture. Cold air was pouring through the gap. Their fire roared in the hearth but could not possibly compensate for the heat loss through the damaged roof. Duncan pounded on the door. Lachlan opened it immediately, his face showing relief at seeing another person. The interior of the cabin was chaos. Ice chunks lay scattered across the floor. The temperature inside felt barely warmer than outside despite the massive fire. Moira huddled near the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Their situation was desperate and becoming more so with each passing minute. The fire was consuming their remaining firewood at an unsustainable rate, and even that heat was pouring out through the damaged roof faster than it could warm the space. Duncan made a decision he had been debating during the walk over. He told Lachlan they needed to abandon the cabin and come to his place until the temperature moderated. Lachlan started to protest, saying something about not wanting charity, but Moira interrupted him. She understood they could not survive the night in a cabin with a damaged roof during the worst cold anyone had seen in years. Duncan helped them gather essential items while the fire still provided minimal light and warmth. The journey back to Duncan's cabin was brutal despite the short distance. Moira struggled in the deep cold, her breathing labored, and Duncan and Lachlan had to support her between them. The cold seemed to have physical weight, pressing against them, stealing their breath and strength. Duncan kept them moving, knowing that stopping even briefly could be fatal. When they finally reached his cabin and pushed through the door into the warmth inside, all three of them stood gasping, their lungs burning from the extreme temperature change. Lachlan and Moira's reaction to Duncan's cabin interior was immediate and visible. They stood near the door, still shivering, looking around with expressions that mixed confusion and wonder. The cabin was genuinely warm. Not the desperate marginal warmth of their own place where you huddled near the fire and still felt cold, but actual, comfortable warmth that filled the entire space. Duncan's fire in the hearth was modest, probably a third the size of the inferno they had been maintaining in their own cabin, yet the temperature was noticeably higher. Duncan directed them to sit near the fireplace while he added a few logs and prepared coffee. Moira asked how his cabin stayed so warm with such a small fire. Duncan explained briefly about the double roof and the air gap, though he kept his explanation simple and avoided sounding like he was lecturing them. Lachlan listened silently, his face showing a mix of emotions that Duncan recognized. Shame at needing rescue, embarrassment at having mocked Duncan's construction, wonder at the evidence of what proper engineering could accomplish. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee and letting the warmth restore them. The contrast between Duncan's cabin and their own was undeniable and overwhelming. Everything they had believed about cabin construction had proven inadequate when faced with truly severe conditions. Duncan had been right, and they had been wrong, and the evidence sat around them in the form of comfort and safety while their own cabin stood uninhabitable 200 yards away. Lachlan finally spoke, his voice quiet. He said that he had been a fool for mocking Duncan's work. He admitted that he had seen Duncan's construction as unnecessary complication, as a waste of time and resources, and that he had encouraged others to view it the same way. Now his own family had nearly died because he had trusted traditional methods without questioning whether those methods were actually adequate. Duncan told him that tradition served people well until conditions exceeded what tradition was designed to handle, and that no one could be blamed for not anticipating weather this extreme. But Lachlan shook his head. He said that Duncan had anticipated it, or at least had built something capable of handling it, and that the difference between them was that Duncan had thought carefully about the problem, while Lachlan had simply done what everyone else did. Moira added that pride had nearly cost them their lives, and that she would not forget the lesson. Duncan let the conversation end there, understanding they needed time to process what had happened. The extreme cold lasted 6 days. Temperatures remained below -35 throughout that period, moderating slightly during daylight hours but plunging even lower at night. Lachlan and Moira stayed in Duncan's cabin the entire time, sleeping on blankets near the hearth while Duncan took the raised sleeping platform he had built. The three of them settled into a quiet routine of survival, maintaining the fire, preparing simple meals, and waiting for the weather to break. Duncan's firewood consumption remained sustainable throughout. He burned approximately 5 logs per day, slightly more than his normal rate, but nowhere near the desperate consumption that characterized single-roof cabins during extreme cold. His calculations proved accurate. When the temperature finally began rising on January 23rd, he still had more than 3 cords of wood remaining. At his current rate, he would finish winter with at least a cord to spare. The previous winter, he had nearly run out completely. Word of the Drummonds' situation and Duncan's rescue spread through the settlement as soon as travel became possible. Angus Rafferty appeared at Duncan's cabin on January 25th, after temperatures had moderated to -10, which felt almost warm by comparison. Angus examined Duncan's cabin carefully, walking around it slowly, looking at the double roof structure with new eyes. He asked detailed questions about the construction, the air gap dimensions, and the firewood consumption rates Duncan had observed. Angus admitted he had been wrong about Duncan's design. He said the words plainly, without hedging or excuses. During the worst cold, Angus had burned through nearly 2 weeks' worth of firewood in 6 days. His cabin had been barely habitable despite the massive fire he maintained constantly. Ice had formed on his interior walls. Frost had covered everything more than 5 feet from the hearth. He had seriously considered abandoning his claim and retreating to Helena, knowing he could not endure another winter like that. Young Josiah Crane visited 2 days later with a notebook and pencil. He wanted to learn Duncan's techniques in detail. He asked about post spacing, rafter dimensions, roof pitch calculations, and air gap requirements. Duncan spent an afternoon explaining the principles and sketching diagrams. Josiah said he planned to build a similar structure before the next winter and asked if Duncan would be willing to advise during construction. Duncan agreed, noting that spreading knowledge that helped people survive was more important than protecting proprietary methods. Even Lachlan, once he had returned to assess damage to his own cabin, came back to ask Duncan about rebuilding. The ice dam collapse had destroyed a section of roof that would require substantial repair. Lachlan asked if Duncan thought it was worth adding a second roof to his existing structure, or if he should simply rebuild from scratch using the new design. Duncan suggested that retrofitting would be difficult, and that starting fresh would produce better results. Lachlan said he would begin planning reconstruction as soon as spring conditions permitted. 5 years passed. Duncan McVeigh continued working his homestead claim through those years, successfully completing the requirements and receiving full title to his land in 1881. He expanded his cabin slightly, adding a storage room under the same double roof protection, and maintained his property with the same careful attention he had applied to the original construction. His firewood consumption remained low compared to neighbors. His cabin remained dry, warm, and structurally sound through winters that ranged from mild to severe. The term McVeigh roof entered common usage in the northern Montana settlements. By 1882, at least 15 cabins in the area had been built using Duncan's double roof design or variations of it. Josiah Crane built one of the first copies in the spring of 1877, working carefully from Duncan's instructions and achieving similar thermal performance. Lachlan Drummond rebuilt his cabin with a double roof in 1878. Even Angus Rafferty eventually added a second roof to his existing structure, though he complained constantly about the additional work required. The technique spread beyond the immediate settlement. Travelers passing through the area noticed the unusual construction and asked about it. Some carried the knowledge to other communities. By the mid-1880s, variations of the double roof design appeared in settlements across the Northern Territories where severe cold made traditional construction inadequate. The specific details varied based on available materials and individual builder preferences, but the core principle of creating a thermal buffer through an air gap remained consistent. Duncan never promoted his innovation or sought recognition for it. He answered questions when asked and helped neighbors who wanted to learn, but he did not travel to other settlements teaching his methods or write articles describing the technique. His military experience had taught him that the best solutions were often quiet ones, implemented without fanfare and judged by results rather than publicity. The double roof worked. People who built them survived winters more comfortably. That was sufficient. Tavish Holcomb died in the winter of 1880, peacefully in his sleep at age 76. Duncan attended the burial and listened to men talk about how Tavish had been one of the last links to the fur trading era, how he had known the mountains before settlements existed. Someone mentioned that Tavish had always encouraged Duncan's unusual building project when others mocked it. Duncan thought about that, about how the old trapper had understood something important about innovation and survival that younger men often missed. In 1883, Duncan stood outside his cabin on a January evening when temperatures had dropped to -20. Snow covered the outer roof in a thick, uniform layer. No ice dams formed, no heat signature showed. Inside, his fire burned steadily, consuming perhaps 4 logs per day, keeping the interior warm and dry. Through the clear, cold air, he could see smoke rising from a dozen cabins scattered across the valley. Several showed the distinctive dual-roof profile that had started with his design. He thought about Callum Horne freezing to death in that Tennessee hide, about his own desperate first winter, about Lachlan and Moira nearly dying 200 yards from safety. Engineering could not eliminate all risks, but it could shift the odds toward survival. Sometimes, that was enough.